The wind carried the scent of smoke and pine through the valley as the last light of dusk slipped behind the mountains. The year was rough, the kind of season where people whispered that the land itself was testing hearts more than hands. In that quiet, between the song of crickets and the distant howl of a lone wolf, she stood trembling in the firelight. Her eyes were steady, though, even if her voice wavered. "I need a fake husband for 30 days, she told the Apache warrior. The words felt heavier than stone, yet once spoken, they could not be gathered back. The request sounded almost foolish against the backdrop of an old American frontier, where survival left little room for schemes or pretenses. But desperation makes its own kind of courage. She had no choice. Too many eyes in town watched her every step, waiting for her to stumble. Too many whispers circled her name, whispers sharp enough to cut her spirit if she let them. And so she turned to the one man everyone feared, the one whose silence spoke more than sermons or laws. He was Apache, a warrior, and his world was not hers. Yet something in his dark, unyielding gaze told her he might just listen. The fire cracked, throwing shadows across his broad shoulders and the feathers braided into his long black hair. He studied her with the same patience he used to track game across endless plains, as if her words were footprints in dust that needed reading. His silence stretched, and the night seemed to lean closer. She shifted on her feet, her fingers twisting nervously at the edge of her shawl. She had rehearsed what she would say, but the truth was a stranger when standing face to face with him. She wanted to explain how the townsfolk's judgment had cornered her, how an unwanted suitor threatened to take her life apart piece by piece unless she proved she already belonged to another man. She wanted to explain how 30 days of a false union might buy her freedom. But explanations seemed fragile things before a man who had seen blood spilled and promises broken under the same sky. His voice finally broke the silence, deep and measured. "Why me?" The question was simple, but it carried weight like an arrow notched to a bowstring. Her breath caught, and for a moment she wondered if she had been a fool to think he might agree. Yet something inside her, perhaps that same flicker of courage that had brought her here, steadied her tongue. "Because you owe no one here. Because you walk alone and no one dares challenge you. And because I believe you would not lie unless there was reason." The fire popped sharply, and her words seemed to hang in the smoke drifting upward. He did not answer right away. Instead, he looked past her, toward the dark stretch of hills where stars were beginning to show. His people had been forced into shadows, pushed aside by settlers who claimed the land as their own. He carried the scars of that truth on his spirit, even if his skin bore none to see. To tie himself, even falsely, to a woman of the town, was that not betrayal of everything he had endured? And yet, as his gaze returned to her face, something unspoken passed between them. She was not like the others who mocked what they did not understand. Her voice trembled with need, yes, but not deceit. He could see the weight pressing her down, and though he had never asked for her trust, here she was, offering it in the only way she knew how. The night deepened around them. Sparks floated into the dark like tiny stars, and somewhere in the distance, drums from his people's camp echoed softly. She swallowed hard, waiting, every heartbeat louder than the crackle of fire. If he refused, she had no plan left. If he agreed, their fates would tangle in ways neither could predict. Finally, he stepped closer. She could feel the heat of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breath. 30 days, he said, his words low, almost carried away by the wind. Her chest tightened with relief, yet her heart raced with fear. She had what she asked for, but she also knew bargains like this carried hidden costs. Nothing in this land came without a price, especially when hearts were involved. She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with the storm of emotions swelling inside her. In that moment, as the firelight flickered between them, she realized something terrifying. Pretend or not, there was no way to guard herself from what might come. He reached for the edge of the flame with a stick, pressing it into the earth until embers hissed. His gaze locked with hers once more. "But know this," he said slowly. "A lie told long enough can turn into truth. If you choose this path, there may be no turning back." Her breath caught again. The air between them pulsed with the weight of the unspoken, the future stretching before them like the endless frontier wild, untamed and merciless. She wanted to answer, but no words came. Instead, the fire roared higher, as if the night itself swallowed her voice. And in that silence, one truth became clear. This was no longer just about 30 days. This was about two worlds colliding. And neither would emerge unchanged. The moon slid higher in the sky, silver light painting the land. Somewhere, a coyote cried into the night. And beneath that vast American sky, the bargain was sealed not with ink or paper, but with fire, silence, and the beating of two uncertain hearts. What neither of them could know then was how quickly 30 days could burn away, and how dangerous it was when a pretend vow began to feel like something more. Would she survive the whispers and schemes of the town? Would he endure the suspicion of his own people? Or would the lie they forged under the stars bind them tighter than either dared to admit? The fire hissed again, sending a swirl of sparks into the dark, as if the land itself already knew the answer. But for now, it remained hidden, waiting for the days ahead to unfold. And she stood there, staring into his eyes, knowing that the story of their 30 days had just begun. The days that followed moved slowly, as though time itself wanted to test the truth of their bargain. Morning sun spilled over the valley and painted the cabins, barns, and crooked fences of the settlement in pale gold. The town, though small, carried an energy that could crush the spirit of anyone who dared walk against its grain. Every street, every porch seemed to hold eyes that judged, and every whispered word felt sharp enough to draw blood. She knew those eyes would turn sharper now that she was tied. Even in pretense, to a man who belonged to another world, the Apache walked beside her, silent as a shadow. His stride carried the patience of a hunter and the watchfulness of one who never fully trusted the ground beneath his feet. People moved out of their way, some stepping aside with unease, others clutching their children's hands tighter. Murmurs rose as quick as dust behind a horse's hooves, carried through the air until she could almost hear them clear. What is she thinking? It cannot be true. She is out of her mind. Their stares pressed against her back, but she held her head high, refusing to bend to the weight of their words. What they did not know, and what she did not dare tell, was that the choice had not been born of madness. It had been born of necessity. The man who had threatened her future was still watching, waiting. He was a settler with influence, someone who believed he could take what he wanted by force or by law. Alone, she would have no defense. But tied to a warrior who feared no man, she hoped those intentions would wither before they could strike. The Apache said little during those first days. His silence was not empty, though. It was the kind that held thought, memory, and a sense of boundaries drawn by years of loss. He watched the people as if measuring them, reading every gesture the way he read the tracks of deer or the bend of grass in the wind. His presence unsettled the townsfolk, but it steadied her in ways she had not expected. Standing at his side, she felt both shielded and exposed. Shielded because no one dared approach too close. Exposed because every move she made now belonged under the magnifying glass of gossip at night. When the fire burned low, she often wondered if she had made a mistake. The bargain weighed on her, especially when she caught herself watching him too closely, memorizing the shape of his shoulders or the way the firelight glinted in his dark eyes. It was dangerous to feel anything beyond the promise they had made. Dangerous to let her heart wander where it should not go. And yet, in the quiet hours, her heart did not always listen to her mind. He noticed, though he never spoke of it. His people had taught him to see what others tried to hide. The small tremor in her hands when she poured water, and the tightness in her jaw when someone's words cut deep. The way her eyes lingered on him as if searching for an answer to a question she dared not ask. He kept these observations to himself, carrying them silently as he carried the scars of his own past. In truth, he had his own reasons for agreeing. Though she had asked for 30 days, though she had promised it was only a lie to shield herself, he had seen more in her than desperation. She carried a spark, one that reminded him of something he had once known, something he had almost forgotten. To stand beside her was to feel, for the first time in many seasons, that the world was not entirely lost. Still, he guarded himself, for he knew that lies, even harmless ones, had the power to cut deeper than blades. As the days slipped into weeks, the town grew restless. Some people whispered that she had fallen under some spell, and no woman in her right mind would tie herself to a man who lived by different laws, who prayed under different stars. Others whispered that perhaps it was all for show, that the union was nothing but a curtain to hide a deeper scandal. The air around them thickened with suspicion, and though no one dared confront them directly, she could feel the storm building in every sideways glance and half-spoken word. Her unwanted suitor did not stay silent either. His smile was sharp whenever he saw her pass, as if to remind her that 30 days was nothing against the weight of time. He had power, connections, and a will to bend rules in his favor. She knew he would not give up, not while she stood defiant against him. Each day that passed felt like walking a narrow ridge with danger yawning wide on both sides. One evening, the Apache stood near the river, the water reflecting streaks of fading sunlight. She approached quietly, her heart heavy with the unease that never seemed to lift. He did not turn to her right away, but he spoke as though he had sensed her before she even reached him. "They do not trust me, and they do not trust you for standing beside me." She lowered her gaze, her fingers brushing the rough fabric of her dress. "I know, but it is the only way. If I stand alone, I will lose everything. If I stand with you, at least I have a chance." His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes softened for a moment. "And when the 30 days are done, what will you do then?" The question struck her harder than she expected. She had been so caught in surviving each day and silencing the whispers and dodging the shadows of her suitor, that she had not dared look beyond the 30 days. The thought of it made her chest ache, though she did not know why. "I will face it when the time comes," she said finally. Though her voice trembled, the river carried their silence, rippling softly beneath the fading light. He wanted to tell her that 30 days would not erase what was being written now, that lies have a way of becoming truths when hearts are involved. But he held his tongue, for he knew that to speak it aloud would change everything. Back in town, the pressure only grew. Children whispered behind fences, women stared with pursed lips from porches, and men muttered disapproval into their mugs. Her suitor watched it all unfold with satisfaction, certain that time would tilt the scale in his favor. He waited for the moment when the Apache would leave, when she would be left exposed again, when her shield would crumble and her future would fall into his grasp. But what none of them expected, not even she, was how the lines between lie and truth began to blur in small, subtle ways. A hand held longer than needed. A glance that lingered too long. Words spoken in quiet tones that carried more weight than they should have. And so the days passed, each one bringing them closer to the edge of something neither could predict nor control. The fire of suspicion burned brighter in the town. The suitor sharpened his plans in secret. And beneath it all, two hearts beat against the pull of fate. Knowing that the bargain they had made might soon demand a price they were not ready to pay, the 30th day drew nearer, carrying with it a tension that thickened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The question was no longer whether they could pretend. The question was whether they could survive what came after. The days slipped by like sand through open fingers. Yet each one seemed to carry more weight than the last. The town grew louder with its whispers, even though voices dropped when she passed. She could feel the stares pressing against her back at the general store, at the well, at the church steps. The Apache walked beside her in silence, tall and steady, and though he never flinched under their judgment, she could feel the divide stretching wider with every passing moment. To the townsfolk, he was not a husband, but a stranger who carried shadows with him. To her, he had become both shield and burden, though she dared not speak it aloud. Her suitor, the man who had sparked this entire ruse, made his presence known in ways that left her unsettled. He no longer hid his smirks when their eyes met across the street. He tipped his hat with mocking courtesy as though each gesture reminded her that he still waited. Sometimes she found small signs that he had been near a broken flower stem by her window. Boot prints pressed into the soil outside her cabin. He was reminding her that he was patient. And patience in men like him was more dangerous than rage. The Apache saw these things too. His gaze lingered on the ground, on the edges of shadows, on the corners where silence felt too heavy. He read them like warnings carved into stone. He knew predators did not always strike quickly. Sometimes they circled, testing the ground before leaping. One evening, as they walked back from the river, he paused and placed a hand lightly on her arm. "He is watching closer now," he said. She felt her breath catch at the certainty in his voice. "You must be careful." She nodded. But the truth was, she had never been careful enough. She had never expected her life to twist into this tangle of fear and defiance. She had wanted only a way out, and now she found herself trapped in a lie that felt more real with each day. The Apache's presence was supposed to be protection, nothing more. Yet when he stood near, she felt safer than she had in years. That safety was dangerous in its own way, for it made her long for something she was not meant to have. Meanwhile, the town was not idle. The preacher had called her aside after service, his brow lined with disapproval. He asked questions wrapped in scripture, pressing for explanations she could not give. "Your bond must be blessed before God," he told her, though his eyes betrayed doubt that any blessing could cover what she had chosen. She murmured answers she did not believe, trying to convince him that everything was proper. But she left the church with a hollow ache. Knowing that suspicion had only deepened, her closest friend, one of the few women who had once trusted her, no longer visited her cabin. Fear, it seemed, spread quickly among the townsfolk. To be tied to an Apache warrior was to invite judgment, and few dared to risk sharing that burden. Loneliness crept into her nights, broken only by the steady crackle of the fire and the quiet presence of the man who had agreed to her desperate plea, yet not all eyes in town looked on her with scorn. Some of the younger folk, restless with the rigid ways of their elders, whispered curiosity instead of condemnation. They watched how the Apache carried himself, how he moved with strength, but also with restraint, never raising his hand in anger despite the glares. To them, he was a figure both mysterious and compelling, someone who did not bow to the rules written by others. They saw in him something different, and in her, perhaps, a courage they wished they had. But curiosity was no shield against conflict. Trouble brewed in quiet corners, carried by men who muttered in saloons and clutched their pride like weapons. The suitor knew how to stoke their fear, how to twist their unease into anger. He spoke of danger, of the need to protect their women and children, of the threat of letting someone from another world walk freely among them. His words spread like smoke, unseen but choking, until it became clear that it was not only her suitor she needed to fear, but the whole tide of voices rising against them. The Apache remained outwardly calm, but inside he carried his own storm. He knew too well the cost of being seen as enemy simply for the blood in his veins. His people had suffered for generations under that same weight. To step into the town was to step into a pit that had swallowed many before him. And yet, for reasons he did not fully understand, he stayed. He had promised 30 days, but already the line between duty and choice blurred. He found himself watching her when she did not see, noticing the way she tucked hair behind her ear when nervous, the way her eyes softened when she looked toward the hills as though longing for escape. He told himself it was only the role he played, the need to study her so their ruse could be convincing. But each time his heart quickened, he knew it was more than that. As the days wore on, the conflict grew heavier. It was no longer just between her and her suitor, or her and the town. It was also within her own heart. She began to wonder what 30 days would mean when they ended. Would the Apache walk away without a word, leaving her to face the storm alone? Would she return to the life she had before, a life marked by fear and silence? Or had something already changed that could not be undone? The suitor grew bolder. One night, she found a note slipped beneath her door. The writing was sharp and deliberate. "Your time is almost up. When he is gone, you will belong to me." She crumpled the paper in her hand, her chest tightening with dread. She wanted to burn it in the fire, but the Apache took it from her fingers and studied it without a word. His jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Instead, he folded it and tucked it away, as though keeping the threat close would remind him of the danger they faced. The nights grew colder, and with them came longer silences. She often lay awake, listening to the wind whip against the cabin walls, wondering if danger would come while she slept. Sometimes she thought she heard footsteps in the dark, though when she looked, there was nothing but shadows. Each morning brought relief, but also the knowledge that time was slipping away. The 30th day loomed ahead like a storm cloud, and with it came choices neither of them wished to face. The lie had begun as a shield, but now it was a thread tying them together in ways they could not easily cut. To untangle it would mean pain. To keep it would mean defiance. Either path promised consequences, neither could escape. And beneath it all, the tension built. The suitor's patience wore thin. The town's unease sharpened into anger. The Apache's silence grew heavier with unspoken thoughts. And she, caught in the middle, felt her world narrowing until every breath carried the weight of what was to come. Yet in that narrowing world, sparks of something unexpected flickered to life. It was in the way he stood close when danger pressed near. It was in the way she looked to him, not just for protection, but for something deeper she could not name. It was in the unspoken truth that 30 days might not be enough to undo what had already begun between them. Still, the storm had not broken. It lingered, waiting, pressing down on them with the weight of inevitability. And as each day passed, they both knew that when it finally did, nothing, not the town, not the suitor, not even the lie they had built would remain unchanged. The air in the settlement grew heavier with each passing day, as though the town itself could sense that something was drawing near. Every corner held a whisper, every face carried suspicion or fear. The lie that had once felt like a lifeline now pressed against her like a trap. She told herself to hold on, to endure until the 30 days were over, but deep down she knew there was no easy end waiting. The town would not forgive, her suitor would not relent, and the Apache would not simply vanish without leaving behind the weight of everything they had endured together. Her suitor's shadow stretched longer across her days. He no longer limited himself to sly smiles or mocking gestures. His presence became bolder, stepping into her path, speaking words meant to remind her of the power he carried. "When this farce is done," he whispered once, as he passed her on the street, "you will see where you belong." His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the threat underneath. She had tried to ignore him before, but now each encounter left her hands trembling and her chest tight with dread. The Apache noticed. He always noticed. His silence grew sharper, his eyes following every move the suitor made, his jaw clenched like a stone refusing to break. Yet he did not act. Perhaps he was waiting, perhaps he was calculating. But she could feel the storm gathering inside him as clearly as she felt it in the town. Each time they crossed paths with the suitor, she sensed the thin line between restraint and violence, and it frightened her as much as it comforted her. The townsfolk became restless too. What had begun as whispers now turned into arguments overheard outside the saloon and the church. Some said the Apache was a danger, that his presence threatened their safety. Others said she had brought shame upon the community by tying herself to him. There were those who feared her suitor's growing influence, yet lacked the courage to speak against him. The preacher's sermons grew sharper, full of warnings about sin and judgment, though his words were aimed more at her than at any scripture. Each Sunday, she felt the weight of every eye upon her, pressing her into the wooden pew until she could scarcely breathe, even among those who doubted. A few voices rose in her defense. Young men, eager to challenge the rigid ways of their elders, whispered that maybe she had chosen courage over fear. A couple of women, weary of the suitor's arrogance, offered her small gestures of kindness, an extra loaf of bread left at her door, a soft smile when no one else was watching. But kindness could not erase the tension. The town was a tinderbox, and she felt certain it would take only a spark to set it ablaze. At night, the unease grew sharper. She would hear creaks outside her cabin, the crunch of boots against dirt, the distant murmur of voices carried by the wind. Once, she found a knife driven into her doorframe, its blade glinting in the moonlight. She wanted to believe it was a warning from her suitor, a sign meant to frighten rather than harm. But the Apache looked at the knife, his eyes narrowing, and said nothing. That silence spoke more than words could. He had begun to keep watch in the evenings, standing outside while the fire inside flickered low. His presence was steady, a sentinel against the dark. She would lie awake, listening for his footsteps, for the quiet sound of his breath when he finally returned inside. There were nights she wished to speak to him, to ask what he was thinking, what he truly saw when he looked at her. But the words stayed trapped in her throat, for she feared his answer as much as she longed for it. The suitor was not content to wait. He began gathering men to his side, men eager for a cause, eager to channel their unease into action. They met in shadows, their voices low, but word spread quickly in a place where secrets never stayed hidden. The Apache heard it too, though he spoke little of it. She could see it in the way his gaze sharpened, the way his hand hovered near the knife at his side whenever they walked through town. He was preparing for something, though. Whether it was defense or retaliation, she could not yet tell. As the 30th day approached, her heart beat faster with each sunrise. She told herself that once the day came, once the bargain was fulfilled, she would be free. But free to what? Free to face her suitor's claim, free to stand alone against a town ready to turn on her. The thought hollowed her stomach. She could not imagine the Apache simply leaving, yet she could not imagine him staying either. The world between them was too wide, their paths too different. And yet, she could not deny the truth. His presence had become as necessary to her as breath itself. The tension built until even the land seemed to echo it. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, heavy and dark, though no rain came. The air was thick, pressing down upon the town like a hand. People spoke in shorter words, glancing over their shoulders, their movements quick and uneasy. Something was coming, and everyone felt it. One evening, as the sky burned with the last light of day, the Apache led her to the river. The water moved slowly, its surface reflecting streaks of red and gold. He stood quiet for a long time, watching the current, before he finally spoke. "They are planning something." His voice was calm, but there was weight in every syllable. "They will not wait much longer." Her throat tightened. What will they do? He turned to her, his gaze steady. "They will test how far they can push. They will see if fear is stronger than truth." He paused, his hand brushing against the hilt of his knife. "You must decide if you are ready to stand when that moment comes." She wanted to tell him that she was ready, that she was stronger than she had ever been. But deep down she knew fear still held her tightly. Her hands trembled, her chest ached. And the thought of standing against not only her suitor, but the whole weight of the town left her shaken. Yet when she looked into his eyes, she felt a flicker of something steady. Something that gave her strength she could not find alone. The days narrowed into a handful, each one pressing closer to the 30th. The suitor's men began appearing near her cabin more often, their eyes sharp, their words taunting. The preacher's sermons grew harsher, warning of judgment if sin was not cast out. Even her few allies grew quiet, unwilling to risk more than they already had. She felt the walls closing in, the world shrinking, until every step felt like walking on the edge of a blade. On the eve of the 30th day, she found herself unable to sleep. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The Apache sat near the door, his knife resting across his lap, his eyes alert despite the hour. She watched him, the weight of everything pressing against her chest until she could no longer keep silent. "When tomorrow comes," she whispered, "what will happen to us?" For a long moment, he did not answer. Then he lifted his gaze, and in his eyes she saw not only the strength of a warrior, but also the burden of choices yet to be made. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "the truth will show itself. And once it does, nothing will be the same." His words settled over her like a chill, filling her with both dread and a strange, aching hope. She turned toward the fire, listening to its crackle, knowing that the night ahead would be long. Somewhere beyond the cabin walls, footsteps stirred in the dark, faint but certain. The suitor was moving. His men were gathering, and the storm they had all felt building was about to break. The night broke into chaos faster than either of them could have prepared for. Shouts rose outside the cabin, boots stomping against the earth, the heavy clang of metal echoing in the dark. The suitor's men had gathered, their courage fed by drink and by his promises of order restored. Torches burned bright against the wind, their glow flickering through the cracks of the wooden walls. She felt her chest tighten, her hands cold, as the sound of fists pounded against the door. The moment they had both feared had arrived. The Apache rose, his knife steady in his grip, his stance unyielding. For a heartbeat, silence pressed heavy, as if the night itself held its breath. Then the door cracked open, under the weight of angry hands, and the suitor's voice cut through the dark like a blade. "It ends tonight. No more lies. No more games." The men surged forward, but the Apache did not flinch. He moved with calm precision, his every motion deliberate. He held them at bay, not striking to kill, but to warn, his presence alone enough to push hesitation into their anger. She stood behind him, her heart racing, fear battling with a sudden surge of courage. For too long she had hidden behind silence, behind others' strength, but she knew that if she stayed silent now, it would all be for nothing. She stepped forward, her voice rising above the clamor. "This is my choice. You speak of shame, of lies, but it is you who bring fear and violence to my door. You call it protection, yet it is only control." Her words rang clear, and for a moment the crowd faltered. The preacher, who stood among them with his torch raised, shifted uneasily, as if her defiance had cracked something in his conviction. The suitor, though only sneered. "You think his presence gives you strength? He is nothing here. When he is gone, you will crawl back to where you belong." He stepped closer, his face lit by the orange glow, his hand reaching for her as though to prove his claim. But before he could touch her, the Apache moved between them, his blade gleaming in the firelight. The suitor froze, his bravado trembling at the sight of unflinching resolve. The standoff stretched into silence. Around them, the men shifted, their courage faltering now that the balance had shifted. Whispers carried through the crowd, doubts rising louder than anger. Some lowered their torches, their eyes darting between the suitor and the woman who refused to bow. The night that had begun with fire and fury now trembled on the edge of collapse. It was the preacher who finally spoke, his voice tight but shaken. "Enough. This is not the way. If she is chosen, then let her choice be. We cannot claim righteousness while we stand here like this." His words broke the fever, and one by one men turned away, their bravado scattered by the weight of reason, and the sight of their leader brought low. The suitor stood frozen, his face pale with rage, his plans unraveled before his eyes, his authority stripped by the refusal of those who once followed him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. At last, with nothing left to claim, he turned and stormed into the shadows, his footsteps heavy against the earth. The crowd dispersed, their torches fading into the night, until only silence remained. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its light soft against the walls. She sank into a chair, her body trembling as the weight of it all settled over her. The Apache stood near the door, his shoulders steady, his eyes still watchful, as though expecting another strike. For a long time neither spoke, the silence filled only by the crackle of the flames. When she finally found her voice, it was quiet, raw with emotion. "It's over." He looked at her, his gaze steady but unreadable. For now, she knew he was right. Though the night had ended, though her suitor had been defeated, the world around them would not forget. The whispers would not vanish overnight, and the scars of what had been done would linger. But for the first time in weeks, she felt the tightness in her chest loosen, as if a heavy stone had been lifted. The 30th day came, and with it the end of their bargain. She woke to find the sun spilling gold across the valley, the air sharp with the promise of a new season. She thought of the words they had spoken, the promise of 30 days, nothing more. Yet when she looked at him, she saw more than a shield, more than the man who had stood between her and danger. She saw someone who had carried her through fire, someone whose presence had changed the shape of her life forever. He prepared to leave, his belongings simple, his movements calm. She felt her throat tighten as she watched him, her heart caught between gratitude and a longing she dared not name. She wanted to speak, to ask him to stay, to confess that 30 days had become something much more. But the words clung stubbornly to her chest, heavy and uncertain. When he turned to her, his expression was quiet. Yet in his eyes, she saw something unspoken, something that mirrored the ache in her own heart. "You are stronger than you know," he said. "Do not forget it." She nodded, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. "And you are not nothing here. Not to me." For a moment, the distance between them felt insurmountable, two lives carved by different worlds. Yet in that silence, there was also a bond forged by fire and defiance, something neither time nor distance could fully erase. He gave her a final look, one that carried both farewell and promise, before stepping out into the morning light. The days that followed were quiet, though not without challenge. The suitor lingered on the edges of town, his pride wounded, but his influence diminished. The townsfolk, unsettled by what had happened, began to soften their whispers. The preacher's sermons grew less sharp, his voice touched by the memory of that night's near ruin. Slowly, life began to stitch itself back together. Though the threads were never quite the same, she carried on. Her steps steadier than before, her voice no longer trembling when she faced the world. She found courage in the simple tasks of her days, in the strength of knowing she had stood firm when it mattered most. And though loneliness sometimes crept into the quiet nights, she held fast to the memory of what had been shared, to the truth that 30 days had shown her a strength she never thought she possessed. Seasons changed, and with them, the rhythm of the land. Yet the memory of that time remained, not as a wound, but as a mark of survival. A reminder that even in the face of fear, choice, and defiance could carve a path to freedom. She never forgot the weight of the Apache's presence, the way his silence had steadied her, the way his strength had shielded her. And though their paths had parted, the bond remained, a quiet echo that lived in her heart. The town learned too, though slowly. Some never forgave, clinging to old ways and old fears. But others found in her courage a lesson, a reminder that strength could take many forms. That truth was not always what tradition declared. The younger ones especially carried that memory forward, their eyes brighter, with the hope of something beyond the narrow lines drawn before them, in time. The whispers faded, replaced by stories told in softer tones. Stories of a woman who stood her ground, of a warrior who carried himself with dignity, of a night when fear was broken by the courage to speak. These stories grew, shifting in the telling, but always carrying the heart of what had been, and she, living her life in the quiet rhythm of seasons, carried her own private story, not of lies or bargains, but of 30 days that had changed everything. She carried it like a flame, small but steady, lighting her path forward. In the end, the resolution was not loud or triumphant. It was quiet, human, woven into the fabric of her days. It was in the way she walked through the town without bowing her head, in the way she faced the future without fear. It was in the memory of a bond that had taught her that strength was not given, but found, and that even the heaviest storms could be weathered with courage. The story closed not with the breaking of hearts, but with their quiet endurance. A woman who had found her voice, a man who had kept his promise, in a town forever marked by the night when fire and fear were faced, and the truth at last was spoken aloud.